Welcome back to the Oscar Project Podcast, the show where I discuss Oscar-nominated films year by year. I am your host, Jonathan Eacherberg, and today I'm discussing the 1928 film Street Angel with my friend Beth Lisogorsky, who writes Beth's TV and Film Recommendations newsletter. Beth, thank you so much for joining me to talk about Street Angel today.
Good morning. Thank you. It's great to be here, and thanks for having me.
So before we jump into the film, tell the listeners a little bit more about yourself.
Yeah, so I'm a film and TV critic. I have a Substack that's called Beth's TV and Film Recommendations. And I gravitate to films that tend to focus on stories that illuminate the human experience with a particular focus on love and interpersonal relationships. So just tangentially, this past year, I finished first manuscript for fiction, and coincidentally, it's a love story. So this being a romance melodrama was literally right up my alley, or street, as the case may be.
Perfect. Well, thanks for coming on to talk a little bit about the movie.
Awesome.
So before we get ahead of ourselves, I want to cover the basics of the film. Street Angel debuted on April 9th, 1928. The film was directed by Frank Borzage. I think I'm saying that correctly. And the adaptation was by Harry H. Caldwell, Catherine Hilliker, Philip Klein, Marion Orth, and Henry Robert Simmons. And it was based on a play called Lady Crystalinda by Monckton Hoff.
So Street Angel stars Janet Gaynor as Angela, Charles Farrell as Gino, Natalie Kingston as Lizetta, and Henry Armetta as Moschetto. It runs for approximately 102 minutes and was produced by William Fox and distributed by Fox Film Corporation.
And since you're here on the Oscar Project, the film received one Academy Award. It was for Janet Gaynor, who also was nominated for Best Actress for her roles in Sunrise and another Borzage film, Seventh Heaven, both of which will be covered a little bit later in this season. From what I've found, the film is available on import DVD, so not really available in the US, but there are multiple versions on YouTube if you go look there as of the recording of this film, because it recently entered the public domain. So what is Street Angel about? We get a look at, well, it starts off in Naples in an undetermined time period. I don't think we ever really find out when it happens, but I'm assuming it's probably early 1900s, somewhere in that, around the time it was made. We get some goings on in Naples. We see some police officers patrolling the streets, and then we get this really funny scene of the circus leader, Moschetto, that you mentioned, getting accosted by a sausage vendor saying that he stole some sausage. They end up breaking his bass drum for the circus, and get a little action around that.
Yeah, I have to say, I unexpectedly found myself laughing at the first scene, because it just was like, with all the chaos of sort of the street performance and the circus, and
Yeah.
how that bass drum, with the occurrence with that comes in handy later on
Yep.
in the film. I just, and amidst all of this, I think it's a capuchin monkey running around, like, who acts as sort of like an interesting interloper in the love story as well. So I just really loved the beginning of this film, and it was very unexpected, a little bit over the top with the Naples setting.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I thought it worked well.
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned the monkey. I have a note, and I think we'll come to it later on, of just how many different animals there are in this film. We have the monkey, we have a goat, a bear, obviously horses throughout. So it's like it seemed like a lot for something of this. He didn't need all those animals. I guess if they had them around the studio, they probably wanted to use them. But yeah, it struck me that there was a lot of animals in this for some reason.
For sure, and, this is pre-CGI days, right? So with
Right.
the
Yeah.
bear on the set, we know it's a real thing, so
Exactly. So we move away from the scene on the street and end up in the home of this young girl played by Janet Gaynor. Doctor is there. He's tending to the mother. Says, "Oh, things are really bleak. You have to go get this medicine, and you have to do it quickly in order to save her life." So she heads out onto the street and sees a woman who's a streetwalker, making some money on her looks there, and decides that she can try and do the same thing, but obviously she doesn't quite have that skill, and ends up running into finding a food stand, and tries to steal some money from a man who's paying at the food stand, and is immediately caught by the police, which I thought was a little bit too fast. Like
yeah.
she hasn't even finished turning away from grabbing the money, and there's a police officer there waiting for her.
It felt a bit over the top. I won't
Yeah.
it kind of it made me do a double take, like, "Wait, what's happening?" And I watched this on YouTube, I had to rewind it to kinda get, like, "Oh, this is the part where they just found her, and they happened to be at this restaurant stall and took her, like, the second she reached for the money."
Yeah, it was a little too quick. If only all arrests were that easy, that would make the police job a lot easier. So then we get some prison sentencing scenes. She's sentenced to prison. I forget, was it a year? No, was it a year? I can't
I thought
remember
it was
what
a
the.
year, and it was a workhouse, right? It
Yeah,
was,
yeah. So not really prison, but
or
they're transporting her to this workhouse, and again manages to escape in just kind of just like that, just as easily as she's caught. It's very easy for her to kind of run off, and she runs back home, finds that her mother has died in the meantime, and then the police are kind of closing in, and she tries to get away from them, and we that's where we bring back the circus performance from before, where she hides in the bass drum that was broken, and they kind of conceal her as the police are looking for her.
Yeah, I this whole scene, multiple scenes, but it folded pretty quickly, so the mother's dramatic death, and, I thought that was sort of a beautiful moment, though, when she comes back and sees her mother has died, and, like, she's sort of at this, like, precipice of, "What do I do? How do I get out of here?" And the circus, from the beginning, it comes back into effect, and she's able to find refuge there with this sort of traveling carnivals. I thought that was sort of a beautiful part of the story, and while this is a love movie between, a man and a woman, there's also, of course, like, this love for the mother that comes into play,
Mhm.
and you see this kind of driving her to these desperate acts of, for which she gets convicted. So,
Yeah, yeah, and also too, in a sense, I wouldn't say love, but the affection for her from the carnival people. I mean,
yeah.
they accept her as she is, and I think they realize that she's probably not as bad as whatever their police are chasing her for. It was probably just a mistake. So I think they are, they're all of the same type of person, I think, and the carnival folks recognize that and say we got to protect this girl.
Yeah, and they're pretty open-minded, and who knows if, like, they've also committed acts
Right. Yeah.
they're sort of, like, might have been a little bit worse, but yeah, I found them to be incredibly, like, almost like a family, and who knows that, I did not know this when I first started watching the movie that she would be such an amazing kind of dancer and acrobat
Right.
and all of those things, but I found her physicality to be pretty admirable too in the film.
Yeah, and I actually had a note too about that physicality. Obviously, where you mentioned earlier, no CGI, nothing like that. There was part when she's running away from the police officers that she's kind of climbing down the outside of a building, and I wondered, is that Janet Gaynor doing her own stunts? Is
Yeah.
she doing all that stuff? And you mentioned later there's the dancing, that obviously a lot of that is actually her.
Mhm.
And then the kind of the turning point in the movie, I think, when she gets injured a little bit later on. That I'm sure is probably some sort of double or doll or something, but, she's obviously doing a lot of difficult work in here.
Yep, I noticed that too. I was like, "This is pretty impressive stunt work," and I started to pay attention more to the, like, musculature and the legs of even, like, Luzetta, the other character, like, there's just some impressive conditioning on the part of these women in
Yeah,
this film that is sort of something exceptional.
yeah, and I think, I mean, to me, a lot of that probably comes from the fact that a lot of these, not just the women, but the men too, at this time are vaudeville performers. They're used to being on stage, doing acrobatics, doing all sorts of stuff like that, that they had to be fit in order to survive some of that stuff.
For sure, that makes a lot of sense.
So, we come a little bit later in time, and she's now performing with the troupe, and it was interesting to me that, we mentioned at the top her name is Angela. We don't even find out her name until this scene with the troupe where the circus director is kind of calling her out, "Hey, we're losing people. You got to get out there and perform." That's when we first find out her name is Angela. Up till then, she's just a girl. So he sends her out to perform. There's the painter down the street who we find out is named Gino, and that's the Charles Farrell character. She tries to tell him to buzz off, and he ends up coming over and joining the troupe instead.
I think I need to pause there for a second because I'm, like I mentioned, I'm very invested in like meet cutes and love relationships. And so I found their meet cute to be particularly kind of falls into the, if you know these tropes of romance, like the enemies to lovers, at least on her side. For him, it felt like it was like love at first sight, or he was charmed at first sight by her. And I kept trying to figure out, why is she so upset with him? Like, I get that he's kind of invading on their turf in terms of coming out with the goat and maybe taking the attention away from the audience of those circus goers. But it felt like almost unwarranted hostility towards Gino, and I couldn't quite figure that, like,
Yeah.
where that motivation was coming from, apart from just setting up a very dramatic kind of love, enemies to lovers kind of trope. So that was the other thing. I was curious if you had thoughts about that too.
Yeah, no, I saw that too, and the thing that I noted about that scene, and this probably comes from looking at it with 2024 eyes, where we've seen all these tropes over and over again, that you can tell as soon as she goes up to him that they're gonna end up together.
Yeah.
It's what goes without. Obviously, they're the stars of the movie, and you kind of know that going in, but they really weren't trying to hide too much in terms of this is what's gonna happen with these two characters.
Yeah, and I know we'll talk about this a little later, but they were both in Seventh Heaven, so, like, this
Yep.
pairing, right, is one that was well known to kind of theater goers.
Yep.
So, yeah, that there were no surprises that they got together, and they seemed equally suited for each other, right?
Yeah, and of course too, the in the scene, I guess right before she goes out to talk to him, the other woman in the troupe, the fortune teller, says, "Hey, love is coming,"
Yes,
and then the next person she meets is this guy, who ends up being her
that's
lover.
right.
So they're continuing to perform. He's doing his painting thing, and then they're in some sort of seaside town. I don't think we really know where that is. And she, as I talked about earlier, she ends up getting hurt during a performance, and they decide to go back to Naples, where the whole thing started, so that she can get better there. And of course, she's like, "No, I don't want to go back there," but doesn't really tell him why. And then kind of is like, "All right, fine, whatever. We'll head back and hope for the best."
There's some, I was thinking about this along the way because, obviously you can appreciate this too as like a writer or storyteller. The lines of this film in the narrative, when they flash those on screen, as he's trying to paint her and sort of win her affection. I think this was a quote that came out there. He says, like, if the quote comes up, "Love is like the measles. When it comes, you can't stop it." So I
Yes.
found that to be, like, very telling of their relationship overall. Like, it's sort of, there's some resistance by her in the beginning, and then it's like a clash, and then it's so strong. And yet, I know this is 100 years ago, but she can't tell him. I mean, even you see plots like that nowadays, but he
Yeah.
doesn't wanna talk about her tarnished past, even though I feel like it's fully explainable. There's nothing to be, like,
Yeah.
worried about. But yeah, like, just that, she spent so much time concealing those
Yeah.
facts that that becomes part of the drama and the story too, and gets us to the climax. But yeah, I found that to be, a really great line, that love is like the measles. So
Yeah, I noted that line too, and I think you're right. I think it makes sense to talk about that a little bit now, about how justified were her actions. She was trying to get money to save her mother's life, essentially, and coincidentally, we're kind of in a world now where we are dealing with healthcare that is expensive for people, and people can't get their drugs. So 100 years later, some things haven't changed. So not to be political about anything, but it's interesting to see how some of those themes come back and continue from stuff that was relevant that much time ago.
yeah, and that if you think about her conviction, and even as I know we haven't got to this part of the plot, but even as she's rediscovered when she goes back to Naples, I found that to be particularly harsh in terms of, clearly not just being repentant, obviously, but that these were crimes that hadn't necessarily happened. Sure, there might have been intention there, but it was
Yeah.
so I found even that to be a pretty heavy sentence, and just a very, like, a sort of a binary black or white reading, of the situation, that felt harsh, but I mean, likely the case, right? There were
Yeah.
no shocks there. So
So they return to Naples against her wishes, and Gino gets to work selling his paintings. He does end up selling a painting of Angela that he made, and for a pittance, essentially. And that was a very interesting kind of side plot for me, that this art dealer is going to buy his painting and then kind of cut it up and make it look like some old master's painting has been discovered anew. every once in a while, it just came back to that for like 30 seconds to a minute, and I was like, "Oh, yeah, that's right. They were doing this thing with the painting."
Yeah.
And then it went back to the love story.
I know, and I was kind of fascinated by that, like, I almost wish there was more of that in this because 'cause I'm like, "What was that like in this time period?" Like, what was that whole, like, sort of black market for these things and these, cutting up these paintings to look like oil masters of the past and being able to sell it at a much higher price. So I think the historian in me and just, being into some of these, like, crime stories, I was like, "I really wanna understand more of this." So I found that to be really cool. I also we'll get to this in the reviews part, but one of the reviews I read cracked me up so hard because it made fun of the painting. It's not a great quality painting of her, and it's
No.
even a super likeness of the character of Angela, and I just couldn't stop. I was like, "Yeah, it was a little over the top to think that this really looked like her and that this
Right.
could be a master or, be confused with one of the great masters." So, yeah, I that was enjoyable.
Yeah, I noted that as well, and I think I came across a similar review, if not the same one, and it made me wonder, obviously, someone had to make that painting because it was a practical thing in the film. So did they make it on purpose to look that way, or was it just kinda that they were trying their best and that's how it came out, which
Yeah, and also, was that an art gallery where it was showing? I was trying to is this a museum, an art gallery? It obviously seemed like a very upscale place that it was being housed and and with somebody else's name on the painting, but, yeah, I was trying to it almost at the end scene, it looks like almost spiritual in terms of church, and then but couldn't really figure out the placement of where that painting existed in the end.
Yeah, I think at the end, I think it is in a church at the end,
Okay.
if I remember some of the reading that I did, but, yeah, you're right, it does seem to move around, and I almost wonder, I wish I'd been able to find the source material, the Lady Crystallinda play
Yeah.
to see, because it seems I get the sense that that play is more about the painting than about, obviously, there's probably a love story in there, but it feels like the painting is the thing in that play, and they just kinda put that off to the side and mentioned it a few times when they decided to make a film out of it.
Yeah, and I think at the end, you get the sense of the symbolic, importance of it and what it is. I mean, it's a salvation moment, but I think carrying that thread throughout, you get it in bits and pieces, but I don't know that it's such a strong through line.
Yeah, definitely not as consistent as
Yeah,
it could be.
yeah.
Alright, so he sells that painting. He also gets a contract to paint a mural, at a new theater, I think it is, and he obviously must get some sort of initial compensation for that. Comes home fully loaded with food, bottles of wine. They decide to celebrate, and of course, that's the moment when a police officer arrives and knocks at the door and recognizes who Angela is. Tries to take her off back to jail, back to the workhouse, and she says, "No, no, 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 let Gino down gently. He doesn't know who I am. He doesn't know what I've done." And then she proceeds to get him drunk and put him to bed so she can go off and go back to jail,
Yes.
which I'm not sure is really a better way to go about that, but
Right, because then he just thinks she disappeared. I also
right.
there's this, like, this is probably more telling of my own values, but it really, thinking about Gino's history and Angela's, like, one of the points he makes throughout is, "I wanna ask you to marry me once I have money," right? Once I'm
Yeah.
sort of a paid artist, and then to just spend his commission on a bunch of salamis, like, I was
Yeah.
cringing, and I know
Yeah.
that, like, there's the romantic in me that was like, "Of course, he's setting up this moment, and he wants to marry her and show that he's responsible," but I'm like, the responsible thing would have been not to buy, like, the entire delicatessen.
Right. Yeah.
This was a part of me that and the wine and all that. So I think I was having a hard time, like, dealing with that choice, and I got
Yeah.
stuck in it for a moment. But yeah, definitely that she has this hour, right? The policeman sees her in the street, recognizes her. She's like, "I just want an hour with him," right? And all that stuff unfolds with him pretty quickly, like for an hour time span. I was like, wow, she's getting a lot done, like drunk and massaging his feet and all that other whatever, taking his shoes off. And I was like, there's a lot going on here. And then, to not leave a note to even say, I have to leave
Right.
here,
Right.
whatever. Uh,
He just wakes up and she's gone.
yeah.
Yep, so obviously she's gone, she goes back to the workhouse, and he falls into a slump, can't do anything, can't paint, ends up getting fired
Yes.
from the mural work. Meanwhile, she's kinda happy as a clam in the workhouse, thinking that he's doing great stuff out in the world, and, she even is asked by someone there, "How can you be so happy while you're in a place like this?" And then she runs into, I guess, the character that we haven't really mentioned, Lizetta,
Uh-huh.
who is their neighbor, I guess, in wherever they live, who's also a street angel, if you will, or at least that's what it's implied that her profession is.
She's the real street angel, right?
Right. Yeah, because she's paying her rent on time with that
Right.
work, whereas Gino and Angela are never on time with rent. So I like that character because it's not a huge role, but she's obviously there as kind of a counterpoint to Angela. But and I noted down there's one scene where she's kind of looking off at the two of them kind of wistfully,
Mhm.
and I was wondering, does she does she want what they have together, or does she want Gino? Is she lusting after him, or is she lusting after the what they appear to have in the true love?
I thought both, right? And I think that
Yeah,
comes to light in the rest of the story that she's equally wanting whatever that is, that kind of true love. And then at the same time, she's like, maybe this is a guy who can actually appreciate me and want me in those ways. I think,
yeah.
yeah, both are true.
Yeah, so then kind of the climax after Angela's released from jail, well, Lizetta kind of spills the beans about what Angela had done, and then Angela and Gino kind of connect after she's out of jail, and then you mentioned earlier they're in, I think it is the church at the end, and he's about to hit her, punch her, something, and then
Yes.
he sees the painting again, and he's got this heavenly moment. He sees her for that. He remembers that he loves her and begs forgiveness, and they kind of hug, and that's the end, and everybody's happy again.
Okay, so we have to rewind slightly here, okay? Because I found there's some interesting moments and choices happening. Obviously, you mentioned Gino's despondent when she goes away and has to be in the workhouse for what we assume is a year, right? It's a long time. He's fallen into the stupor, depression, all of that. Lizetta ends up in the workhouse alongside Angela, not surprising because she's a street angel as well and gets
Yep.
arrested. They come out the same day. No judgments here on that choice.
Coincidence, yeah.
It's for the story, but when they come out the same day, of course, Angela's going looking for Gino and thinking he's a famous artist, and then, Lizetta finds Gino, like, in a drunken stupor, and there's a weird kinda, like, violence with him and her, which I thought was kind of a little concerning, but again, the time period,
Right.
he's frustrated, he pushes her, she falls down at one point earlier in the plot, and here you can tell he's getting physically riled by what she's saying and uncovering that Angela's not this angel, or this kind of chastity, pure person that, or in his mind that he had made her out to be. And when she says, "Go look for Angela at the wharves," or she might or go to the wharves, he
Yeah.
says this line, "I shall find a girl with the face of an angel and the soul as black as hell." And I feel like at that point, when he says that line and delivers it and then goes, on in this weird trance around the wharves looking, and he finds all these street angels soliciting, when he finally comes across her, it's a very dramatic scene, right? There's
Yeah.
because he's actually trying to strangle her, is from what I because he has his
Yeah.
hand out,
Yeah.
and she's running away from him in a very fast pace, climbing up and down stairs all over the place outside, in the darkness, and then ends up, like you said, at this church. But I found that to be like, wow, he's really, I mean, you could tell he's sort of in this locked trance. And then when he sees the picture and is like faith in her is sort of restored, that this is who she is, and he's able to get back to that place where he had fallen in love with her, all is good. But I found that to be, I don't know, I was sort of perplexed by that choice of I wanna kill her, and then she's, of course, begging for forgiveness from him.
Right.
Again, I know there's sort of the times and whatnot, but, like, it was kind of I was trying to kinda get back to the story of, like, I mean, maybe he just fell into this sort of, again, just despondent state where he was, just completely not himself and maybe disassociated, and that's why he's trying to kill her. 'Cause that was definitely very, very strange, those last few, and I think I wanna say it was, like, at least 7 or 8 minutes of the film.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I almost I wanted to. I always look at things like how would we do this? How would a film today do this part of the story? And I think I almost feel like that the last 30 minutes or so of the story, from kind of when she's discovered by the police officer back in Naples until the end, I feel like that could be its own full feature today, kind of exploring that descent of Gino and the various things that happen there. But yeah, I think it does go to a very dark place
Mhm.
before we get that final, very abrupt turn at the end when he turns back around.
Yeah.
The other thing I was gonna mention on that, just kinda how it reminded me a little bit of Romeo and Juliet at the end, with the whole she's looking for him, he's going, they're both looking for each other, going in different directions. Obviously, ending's a little bit different than how that one ends, but it had a little bit of that feel of, not that he thinks she's dead or anything like that, but that they were both kind of looking at various directions for each other there.
Yeah. You know what's interesting? I finally saw Wings of Desire, the Wim Wenders film, German film from the late
Mhm.
'80s. And, of course, that one's, in black and white in a time where everything was in color by that point, but what I found really there were these certain similarities I kept coming back to in how this film was shot. Speaking of just, like, similarities with other stories or, and one of the things I noted was the use of shadow in it to create these sort of dramatic moments, and also that there's the loss of innocence of the main character. Of course, there you also have, like, the circus connection and this beautiful love story at the center of the story, but there's something very dramatic about both of them and, like, the use of the camera to kind of show those moments of telling that having that story unfold that I felt like I just kept coming back to Wings of Desire for whatever reason. I know that one's obviously about an angel and stuff, but I think in both there's this idea and illusion of who somebody is, what somebody without sort of understanding kind of the full character and circumstances of that person. So
Right.
both of those, like it felt very dramatic. And one of the reviews I read also pointed to how this film is would be described in the style that is Germanic, especially with some of the opening and so I found that to be kind of a particular note when I was comparing it with things that it reminded me of.
Yeah, and you mentioned a couple of reviews. You can jump to those now. Obviously, the through line that I seem to find in all of the reviews that I came across was it's not quite Seventh Heaven. Everyone was,
100%.
it's good, but they were better in Seventh Heaven. And
Yeah.
and I wonder, obviously I'm covering it later in the season, but I haven't actually seen Seventh Heaven yet. So I'm curious once I've seen both of them, what
Yes.
my own comparison is going to be.
Yeah, 100%. I got that too, because at first going into this, I was like, "Oh, she won Best Actress for this, it has to be." And then when I was going to look at the Academy Awards and the actual, like, what won for that year, the director also won for Seventh Heaven,
Right.
and, she won for multiple roles, which was nobody's done that since then, right? Winning,
Yep.
one actress winning multiple characters, but so I one of the, reviews I read from the Motion Picture Magazine, I was alluding to it earlier, they said, because this story is frightfully silly, the painting on which it all hinges is excruciating. And Janet was never meant to be a peppery Italian girl with gestures. She is
Yeah.
mistaken for a streetwalker. Can you imagine even a policeman making that mistake? So I thought that was a funny moment too.
Yeah, yeah, and I had noted that down at the beginning too, about just I mean, she's really bad when she starts doing that at the beginning, like, she's got no clue what to do to get a guy's attention. There's the one guy she's kinda nudging behind, and he's just sitting there eating his snack on the street and paying no attention to her whatsoever.
Yeah. That's right. And I think, like, the close of that review said, "The main trouble is that the picture, while as tender and idyllic as possible, is utterly unreal, but you will undoubtedly love it in spite of everything." And I felt like
Yeah.
that really summed up that the loving it there's just something infectious about this film in a way that I hadn't expected to be really seduced or charmed by it. And despite some of the funny moments or flaws, that we've mentioned here, I felt like it really tied itself up in a way that's memorable and that I now want to watch Seventh Heaven and more silent film than I thought I would.
Yeah, and I thought, I've watched a bunch of silent films for this, obviously, for this first year of the Oscars, they were all silent films for the most part, and a lot of them, everybody's overacting, everybody's being super expressive, and I didn't see that as much in this one. There's a couple moments, but overall, I thought it was pretty well acted in general.
I thought so too. I was a little bit like you, I was expecting it to be kind of overly done, but I felt like everybody I will say of the 2, I think Gaynor was the stronger performer,
For sure.
right? But, having said that, Farrell did like, it's not like the way he was performing was distracting or anything. It's just I could sort of tell the difference in that, and it made me wanna learn more about Janet Gaynor, who went on to become, like, an oil painter, a pretty accomplished
Yep.
woman, and was in Broadway productions. One of them was on Golden Pond. You can find everything in Wikipedia, and she managed to transition to television too. Why I'm like, a lot of those silent film stars going to the talkies was a real big challenge. We see that in the movie Babylon, but yeah, so I was kind of really heartened to see that she went on, and I also kind of did a behind the scenes of was there any chemistry or relationship between these two leads? And apparently Farrell had like a crush on her or something, and that but it was always very platonic. And even to evade his advances, I read that she was married a few times, but one of her husbands she married to try to get out of. Like, I mean, maybe one of those moments is true to the movie where she wants to avoid telling him the truth or something, and so she's
Yeah.
quickly finds an escape path or something.
Oh, shucks. Sorry, I'm married.
But he also became the mayor of Palm Springs. They both found themselves in Palm Springs, which I guess was
Yeah.
surprising for that generation, so
Yeah, no, and I think it's perfect to transition talking a little bit more about the individual contributors to this. Obviously,
yeah.
we talked a lot about Gaynor. The other thing I noted, she was nominated for another Oscar, A Star Is Born in
Yes.
1937. So one of the older versions of that. She was just even despite being the first Best Actress winner, she was also the youngest one. She was only 22 years old when she won, and until 1986, Marlee Matlin 21 when she won in 1986. And I think she is still the youngest to date to win the Best Actress award. Obviously, we typically see that award go to people who've been around a little bit longer, but it was interesting to see that youngest Best Actress lasted as long as it did.
Yeah, I was trying to figure out her age. I'm glad like, I didn't realize how young she was, but I was placing her, like, early 20s, for
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah, she was born in 1906 is what I found. So, assuming they were making it in probably mid to late 1927, she was probably about 20, 21 years old at the time,
Okay.
which feels about right for the character. I mean, obviously we see that a lot of times today where people who are mid-20s or even late 20s playing teenagers in high school. So, and you mentioned Farrell. Actually, I did find out too that they apparently acted together in 12 different films, including these two, this one and Seventh Heaven. So I almost wondered what would the modern day equivalent of that be? I don't think I can think of
I know.
a leading couple like that that has appeared quite as many times as that. The only one that I could even come close to was Adam Sandler and Drew Barrymore.
Yeah. I mean right, and I was thinking maybe, like, even, like, Meg Ryan and Tom Hanks,
Right, yeah.
that many, you think you sort of, like you think it's more than it is, and then you're
Yeah,
like,
and
"Okay,
it's, 2 or 3 at the
that's
most,
right."
and then it kinda peters out.
Yeah.
But yeah, I can't imagine 12 films like that, and I imagine they were mostly romantic roles, at least in some part, so there had to be something going on at least from one side or the other in that off screen.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing I found interesting right here, it's like, it takes so long to create a film and all that. So a director is kind of locked into maybe one film and it takes a few years and this and that. What I noticed in looking at the Academy Awards list here is, the director here got like nominated for a few different, that same
Yeah.
year. And I was like, oh,
They were cranking them
they were-
out back then for sure.
exactly. They were cranking them out. So I'm not surprised that they acted in 12 different movies,
Yeah. Yeah, it's not like today when, Scorsese does a movie every couple of
That's
years
right.
or something like that.
I'm curious if there's a place in our modern world for silent film, and maybe that's another podcast episode, but, like, it's got me
Yeah.
thinking about it, especially, like, with, like, I think Mary Pickford had that line where she said that, I wanna make sure I get it right, but it was something along the lines of how it feels like talking films, silent films should have, like, evolved from, talking films. And I thought it was a really curious. I mean, of course, she is a silent film star,
Yeah.
but I thought that was a really curious and line, and especially with some of the research I've done on Hitchcock and starting in silent and moving, and evolving obviously into talking films and what that did for his style. And, I've just been curious if there's like a place for this in the world today because there's something beautiful about really listening to like synchronized sound of a film and a backdrop of music. And I don't know if you've noticed that this is on a different tangent, but when you watch shows on like Netflix or whatever, I think one of my biggest complaints, I've actually seen this in movies like Challengers and The Substance too, with like newer films, is the soundtrack barraging at different moments and taking the place of narrative at times when I'm like, "Oh, there should be more dialogue," or this or that, or "The sound doesn't work here," versus, like, when I hear these silent films, and in this one in particular, it it works, like, it fits and it kinda creates the mood and effects. So I wonder if some of those elements are being played with modern storytellers and filmmakers as well.
Yeah, I think the one space that I've seen that at least a little bit is in short film,
Yeah.
as especially animated short film. Obviously, on my podcast, I do a lot of interviews with short film directors, and especially in the animated space, a lot of those are for various reasons silent. They obviously have music and sound effects, but there's little to no dialogue in a lot of those, and some of those are some of the best stories that I see in that format. So I think there is a space for it, but I think there's definitely room for it in longer form as well. It's
Yeah.
it's interesting that you bring that up.
Yeah. I was just really happy that you asked me to be on this to because I like, even getting into silent films, I feel like this was a really gateway, choice film for me because now I'm like, "Okay, I wanna explore more." It's been a while,
Yeah.
so it was highly enjoyable to get to review this one.
Fantastic. Well, I guess that brings us to kind of starting to wrap things up. We've already talked about the film at the Oscars. Obviously, Janet Gaynor receiving the Best Actress award, along with not just this film, but her role in Sunrise: A Song of Two Humans and Seventh Heaven, both of which will be featured in future conversations on the podcast. The movie did also receive Academy Award nominations the following year for Best Art Direction and Best Cinematography. And I had found that was obviously it was the first time that happened because this was the first Academy Awards, but it only happened one other time for the film The Quiet One, which I think was a documentary in one year and then a cinematography in another year, something like that. So obviously that doesn't really happen anymore. It's the single year eligibility period for the Oscars. So that's something that can't happen anymore. That was kind of an interesting little factoid.
Yeah, that tracks. I was wondering about that too, because I was like, maybe this is also inflating, like, the thought that all these films are happening the same year. Maybe they actually
Yeah.
were separate years. Yeah.
So I think we've kind of talked through at least a lot of what I have on my list. Anything else you want to touch on before we give our final thoughts and rate the film?
Just I think the opening line of the film, I was so struck by it in terms of its, like, lyricism. I was like, "Is this anywhere else?" And so I had to look it up to see if it was taken from somewhere, but do you remember what it was? Did you write it down?
I did not write it down. I remember noting it, but I couldn't quote it word for word.
And I think this is the one that also made me think of the Wim Wenders film, Wings of Desire. So it was everywhere, in every town, in every street we pass, unknowingly human souls made great by adversity and love. And I just thought that was like, it's just so poetic and beautiful. I was like, wait, what? That immediately hooked my attention. And I think it says a lot about just the beauty and the arc of the film.
Yeah, definitely. Yep, it's definitely an enjoyable film, and which brings me to my rating. Actually, I watched it previously earlier this year, and then had to revisit it, and came in at about a 7 out of 10. So it's good, it's strong. It's not the best for me, but I did really enjoy it. So 7 out of 10 for me.
I gave it an 8 out of 10. I think part of it, we can maybe add a point that I've given because I was pleasantly surprised than what my expectations were. So that might be, weighing the 8 at versus 7. But I thought overall, it does well. Like, I was really happy with it, and it tells a good story, and it's moving, and I'm remembering it, the day after, 2 days after, like, so,
Yeah.
yeah, it sticks with you.
Well, I will be sure to include a list of all of the resources, any links to the reviews and articles that we've mentioned throughout the film, as well as a link to where you can watch it online on YouTube. Beth, thanks again for coming on the show to talk about Street Angel. Let people know one more time where they can find you online.
Yes, so I'm over at Substack, that's TV and film recommendations. So if you, it's under my name, www.bethlisogorsky.substack.com. You can find me there, and thank you so much, Jonathan, for having me on. It was such a delight to get to talk about this film this morning.
And don't forget to follow the Oscar Project at theoscarproject.substack.com. And don't forget to also come back for next Friday's episode of the podcast, where I will be discussing the film Tempest. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope to see you at the movies.